The first time Gareth Pollard appeared on camera, he was sitting in a wooden chair with his back to a window that showed nothing but white sky and the dark edge of a pine tree. The interviewer was a man named Dale Buckner, who ran a shortwave radio program out of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and who had somehow convinced his local cable access station to let him film the conversation. The production quality was terrible. The lighting made Pollard look like he was sitting inside a yellow fog. The microphone picked up wind noise that turned every sentence into something you had to lean forward to hear. None of that mattered. What mattered was the man in the chair. He was somewhere around 50 years old, though the lines on his face suggested a life that had aged him beyond his years. His hair was dark and cut close to the skull in the way of men who do not waste time on appearance. His shoulders were broad under a canvas jacket that had seen weather. His hands rested on his thighs, and they were the hands of someone who had worked with them his entire life. Large knuckles, scarred fingers, the kind of hands that made you understand immediately that this was not a man who operated from behind a desk. His left pant leg was pinned just below the knee. The leg ended there. He made no effort to hide it, and no effort to draw attention to it. It was simply a fact of his body, like the color of his eyes, which were pale and steady, and looked directly into the camera, with the comfort of a man who had decided a long time ago that he was not afraid of being seen. He was afraid of nothing that the camera could do to him. That was the problem. He spoke for 11 minutes. His voice was calm and unhurried, the voice of a man delivering a lecture he had given many times before, and in those 11 minutes he described in specific detail how the Federal Bureau of Investigation had spent 6 years and what he estimated to be several $100 million attempting to locate him. He named the surveillance programs. He named the drone models. He described the communication intercept methods with the casual accuracy of someone who had studied them the way a surgeon studies anatomy, which was where the nickname had come from, though not for the reason most people assumed. They called him the surgeon, not because he cut people. They called him the surgeon because he cut away everything that could be used to find him. He had amputated his own electronic existence with the precision of a man removing a tumor, and what remained was a human being who moved through the American West like a ghost that happened to have a body. And then 7 minutes into the interview, he looked directly into the camera and said a name. Warren LeClaire. He said it the way you might say the name of an old friend you had not seen in years, with familiarity, with something that was almost warmth. 6 years now, Warren, 6 years of your best people and your best machines and your best ideas, and here I am sitting in a chair talking to Dale. Maybe it is time to consider that the problem is not your resources. Maybe the problem is that you are looking for a man who does not exist in the world you know how to search. He smiled. It was a small smile, not cruel exactly, but deeply quietly satisfied in the way of a man who has been winning a game for a long time and has come to enjoy the rhythm of it. But the smile carried something else that the analysts would miss when they reviewed the footage frame by frame in the days that followed. Behind the confidence, behind the performance of invulnerability, there was purpose. Gareth Pollard was not just taunting the FBI for sport. He was building towards something. The interview was not a victory lap. It was a prologue. The clip was uploaded to 3 different websites within the hour. By the end of the day, it had been downloaded and redistributed to places that federal authorities could track but could not shut down fast enough to matter. By the end of the week, it had been viewed by an audience that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and it had been seen by every agent assigned to the Pollard case, and it had been seen by the man whose name had been spoken into the camera. Special Supervisory Agent Warren LeClerc watched the clip 4 times in his office on the 7th floor of the FBI field office in Salt Lake City. He watched it with the sound on and then with the sound off, studying the body language, the background, the quality of light through the window, the species of the pine tree visible at the edge of the frame. He made notes. He sent the footage to the Technical Analysis Unit for geolocation assessment based on the visual environmental markers. The assessment came back 3 days later. The pine tree was consistent with species found across approximately 400,000 square miles of the northwestern United States. The light angle suggested late afternoon, but could not narrow the date beyond a 2-week window. The chair was commercially available from 11 different retailers across the region. The window frame was standard residential construction found in approximately 6 million homes. Leclerc read the assessment and set it on top of a stack of similar assessments that had accumulated over the years like geological layers of frustration. 6 years of work, 6 years of the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus ever assembled by a domestic law enforcement agency. Predator drones borrowed from the Department of Defense flying patterns over the mountain wilderness of Idaho and Montana. The National Security Agency intercepting every electronic communication within a 200-mile radius of Pollard's last known location. CIA analysts building network maps of his organization that covered entire walls of classified briefing rooms. Confidential informants embedded in the communities where his people operated. Wiretaps. Data mining, pattern analysis, satellite imagery updated every 72 hours. All of it pointed at a man who was not there. The thing that made Warren Leclerc's failure so particular, the thing that separated it from ordinary failure, was that Leclerc was not an ordinary agent. He was one of the finest investigators the Bureau had produced in a generation. 15 years of major casework before the Pollard assignment, including 3 separate cases that had resulted in the successful prosecution of domestic terrorist organizations. He understood networks. He understood how men who believed they were invisible made themselves visible through the small daily compromises of living in the modern world. He had built his career on the certainty that everyone leaves a trail, that the electronic infrastructure of contemporary life is a web that no one can move through without touching, and that a sufficiently patient and well-resourced investigator will always find the thread that leads to the center. Gareth Pollard had looked at that certainty and decided it was wrong. He had studied the history. Not casually, not the way most fugitives study the methods of their pursuers, which is to say with the anxious half-attention of men who are afraid. Pollard studied it the way an engineer studies structural failure. He went through every significant arrest and capture of the previous 20 years. Timothy McVeigh, Ted Kaczynski, Eric Rudolph, every militia leader and domestic extremist who had been found and brought in. He cataloged the method of each capture, and when he was finished, he had a list that told him one thing with absolute clarity. They were all found because they communicated electronically. McVeigh was tracked through phone records. Kaczynski's manifesto was published and recognized. Rudolph evaded for 5 years, but was ultimately found through the patterns of his physical movement in a defined geographic area. The common thread was always the same. The target touched the electronic world, and the electronic world told the government where he was. Pollard stopped touching the electronic world. No cell phone. No satellite phone, no email, no radio communication, no electronic device of any kind that could emit a signal, receive a signal, or store data that could be recovered. He communicated exclusively through human couriers. Physical human beings carrying physical messages on foot or by motorcycle through mountain passes and logging roads and trails that did not appear on any map maintained by any federal agency. He moved constantly. He never spent 2 consecutive nights in the same location. He rotated through a network of safe houses and sympathetic properties that had been established over years of patient cultivation properties owned by people who believed in what Pollard represented, or who feared what he would do to those who did not cooperate. He held meetings in farmhouses and ranch properties, surrounded by civilian families and communities where the arrival of federal agents would be noticed and reported within minutes, in locations where the government's most efficient tools could not be deployed without endangering the people the government was supposed to be protecting. 3 times in 6 years, the FBI believed they had him. The first time was in the spring of 2003. 18 months into the investigation, signals intelligence had detected communication from a device that matched the electronic signature of a laptop Pollard had been known to use 2 years earlier. A strike team moved on a ranch property in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana and found 17 men, significant quantities of weapons and ammunition, and evidence of operational planning for activities that resulted in 9 federal indictments. Gareth Pollard was not among them. He had stopped using that laptop 14 months before the raid. The second time was in October of 2005. A confidential informant reported that Pollard would be attending a meeting of senior militia leaders at a hunting lodge outside of Salmon, Idaho. The FBI deployed a 40-person tactical team supported by helicopter surveillance and established a perimeter that covered every road and trail within a 3-mile radius of the lodge. The meeting took place. 11 men were identified entering and leaving the property over a 2-day period. 3 were subsequently arrested on existing warrants. Pollard was not among the 11. The informant, when questioned, insisted that his information had been accurate. 3 weeks later, the informant was found dead on a forest road with injuries that the county coroner described as consistent with the fall from a moving vehicle. The case was never solved. The third time was in April of 2007, just 6 weeks before the events that would end the hunt. Intelligence from multiple sources indicated that Pollard was consolidating his senior leadership in the Clearwater region of northern Idaho, preparing what analysts believed was a major operational push for the coming summer. A joint task force involving FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals moved to establish surveillance and close the net over a 72-hour period. On the second day of the operation, Pollard appeared on Dale Buckner's program again. He was not in Clearwater. He was somewhere else entirely, sitting in a different chair in front of a different window, and he was talking about the weather. This was the moment that broke something in the institutional confidence of the investigation. Not because the information was wrong. The information was right. Pollard had been in Clearwater. He had simply left before the net closed, moved by a counter-surveillance network that the FBI did not fully understand. Warned by sources that the FBI had not identified traveling routes that the FBI could not monitor. He had walked out of the most sophisticated surveillance operation in the history of domestic law enforcement and appeared on cable television 3 days later looking rested and amused. Warren Leclerc was a good man and a good agent. He knew what this meant. It meant that the approach itself was the problem, not the execution, not the resources, not the personnel. The approach. The entire methodology of electronic surveillance and technology-driven target acquisition that had been the foundation of federal law enforcement for 3 decades was designed for a world in which the target participated in the electronic infrastructure of modern life. When the target removed himself from that infrastructure, the methodology did not degrade gradually. It failed completely. Leclerc understood this. Understanding it did not help. The FBI was an institution built on process, and the process was designed for the world as it existed for 99% of targets. Pollard was the 1%. The system did not have a setting for the 1%. And while Warren Leclerc sat in his office in Salt Lake City, understanding the nature of a problem he could not solve with the tools he had been given, 1,200 miles to the southeast, in a small building that did not appear in any government directory available to the public. A woman with gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing was watching the same clip of Gareth Pollard on a monitor and thinking about something entirely different. She was not thinking about technology. She was not thinking about drones or intercepts or the electronic signature of a laptop that had not been powered on in 14 months. She was thinking about people. Specifically, she was thinking about the people around Gareth Pollard. The couriers who carried his messages. The families who sheltered him. The community leaders who warned him when federal agents appeared. The network of human beings that made his invisibility possible. She was thinking about how that network had been built, and she was thinking about how it could be turned. Her name was Elena Drummond. She was 58 years old. She had been doing this work for 33 years, and in those 33 years, she had learned one thing that she considered to be the only thing worth knowing about the business of finding people who did not want to be found. Technology finds machines. People find people. She ran a unit that most of the federal law enforcement community did not know existed. It was called the Shadow Unit, though that name appeared in no official documentation and was used only internally by the small number of people who were aware of its existence. It operated under the administrative umbrella of the United States Marshal Service, which was itself the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country, and which had a tradition of pursuing fugitives that predated the existence of the FBI by more than a century. The Shadow Unit had been created in the late 1990s, in the aftermath of a series of domestic extremist incidents that had exposed a gap in the federal government's capability. The FBI was excellent at electronic surveillance. The ATF was excellent at firearms and explosives investigation. The CIA was excellent at foreign intelligence. None of them were excellent at the specific patient, deeply human work of penetrating closed communities where technology did not reach and where the target's survival depended on the loyalty of the people around him. Elena Drummond had been given the unit because she was the person in federal law enforcement who best understood that specific work. She had grown up in Kemmerer, Wyoming, the daughter of a coal miner who had raised 4 children on a salary that never exceeded $32,000 a year. She had joined the Marshal's service at 25, not because she had a passion for law enforcement, but because it was a job that would take her out of Kemmerer. And she had discovered in her first year that she possessed a quality that could not be trained and could not be taught. She could make people talk to her, not through intimidation, not through the procedural authority of a badge, through something quieter and more fundamental. She listened. She remembered. She came back. She sat in kitchens and drank coffee that was too strong, and asked about children and livestock and the price of hay. And she did this not as a technique, but because she was genuinely interested, because she had grown up in a community like the ones she now worked in. And she understood that trust in these places was not given in response to credentials. It was given in response to presence, to showing up, to being there in the snow and the mud and the silence and coming back again. Over 33 years, she had built a network of human sources across the Mountain West that no electronic surveillance system could replicate. Not registered informants with case numbers and handler protocols, but something deeper and less formal. People who knew her, people who trusted her, people who, when something happened in their community that they believed was wrong, would find a way to let her know. She had known about Gareth Pollard for years. She had been watching his organization grow since before the FBI opened its formal investigation. She understood his network not from satellite imagery and intercepted communications, but from the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge that comes from being present in a community for decades. She knew which ranchers sheltered his couriers. She knew which county officials looked the other way. She knew the names of the men who carried his messages, and the names of their wives, and the ages of their children, and the makes of their trucks. And she had done nothing. 3 times the FBI had requested her unit's cooperation on the Pollard case. 3 times she had declined. The first time in 2004, she had simply said the timing was not right. The second time in 2005, she had told Leclerc's predecessor that premature action would compromise sources that had taken years to cultivate. The third time in early 2007, she had spoken directly to Leclerc himself in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. She told him that she understood the pressure he was under. She told him that she respected the work his team was doing. And she told him in a voice that carried the particular weight of someone who is stating a fact rather than offering an opinion that the FBI's approach to Gareth Pollard would not work, that it could not work, and that when he was ready to try something different, he should call her. Leclerc had not called. He had not called because calling Elena Drummond meant admitting that the FBI could not do this alone, and the FBI was not an institution that admitted that easily. Elena Drummond did not wait because she was passive. She waited because 33 years of field experience had taught her that in certain environments, the ambush produces better results than the pursuit. If you hold still long enough, what you are hunting will come to you. She had built her entire career on this principle, and she had never been wrong. She was watching the Pollard clip on her monitor, and she was waiting. Not for Pollard to make a mistake with technology. He did not use technology. She was waiting for the human network around him to produce an opportunity that no amount of electronic surveillance would ever detect. And in March of 2007, that moment arrived. It arrived in the form of a phone call from a colleague at the State Department who informed her that an Italian journalist named Daniele Ferraro and his American assistant, a man named Ray Whitfield, had been taken hostage by Pollard's organization while investigating the militia's weapons trafficking network in the backcountry of northwestern Montana. The demand was straightforward. 5 senior members of Pollard's organization, currently held in federal custody, were to be released. If the demand was not met, Ferraro would be killed. Elena Drummond listened to the phone call. She asked 3 questions. She hung up. Then she sat at her desk for a very long time, and the expression on her face was not alarm, and not concern, and not the urgent focus of a law enforcement professional responding to a crisis. It was recognition. She had been waiting for this. Not this specific event, not a kidnapping, but this specific shape. An opportunity that placed her unit at the intersection of Pollard's needs and the government's desperation. An opportunity that would allow her to give Pollard exactly what he wanted, while placing inside that gift the instrument of his destruction. The FBI saw a crisis. Warren LeClaire saw a nightmare of political pressure and impossible choices. Elena Drummond saw a door. And she was the only person in the United States government who knew exactly what to send through it. The video arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was sent to 4 news organizations, simultaneously uploaded to a server that bounced through 11 proxy locations before federal cybercrime analysts lost the trail somewhere in the infrastructure of a hosting service registered in Iceland. The technical sophistication of the delivery was notable because it was the only electronic signature Pollard's organization had produced in 18 months, and because it was clearly designed to be untraceable while ensuring maximum distribution. The content of the video was not sophisticated. It was brutal in the way that brutality is always simple. Ray Whitfield knelt in a room with concrete walls and a single overhead light that cast shadows so sharp they looked painted on the floor. He was 41 years old. He had been a freelance research assistant and driver for foreign journalists working in remote regions of the American West for 7 years, and he was good at his job because he understood the territory and the people in it, and because he had the particular calm of a man who had grown up in rural Montana and was not easily frightened by the things that frighten people from cities. He was frightened now. His hands were bound behind his back with zip ties that had been pulled tight enough to turn his fingers dark. His face was swollen on the left side where someone had hit him, and there was dried blood in a line from his hairline to his jaw. He was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who understands exactly what is about to happen and has moved past the panic into something quieter and worse. A voice spoke from off-camera. It was calm, educated, unhurried. It identified Whitfield by name. It stated that the United States government had been given 48 hours to initiate the release of 5 named individuals from federal custody. It stated that failure to meet this deadline would result in consequences. Then the voice said something that would be replayed on news broadcasts for the next 72 hours. This is not a negotiation. This is a demonstration. What followed took less than 2 minutes. The details were reported by news organizations with varying degrees of specificity. What can be said is that Ray Whitfield died in that room, and that the manner of his death was designed to communicate a single message with absolute clarity. This is what happens when demands are not met. The video ended. The world reacted. The Italian government applied immediate diplomatic pressure through every channel available. Ferraro was an Italian citizen with a significant public profile in European journalism, and the political cost of inaction was calculated in Rome within hours. The American media turned the kidnapping into a 24-hour story that dominated cable news for 2 straight weeks. Warren LeClaire found himself in a position that every senior law enforcement official dreads. The decision was no longer his. It had moved above him into the offices of the Deputy Attorney General and the National Security Council, into rooms where the calculations were political rather than operational, where the question was not, how do we find this man, but how do we survive the next news cycle if a European journalist dies on camera and we did nothing? LeClaire argued against releasing the prisoners. He argued forcefully, logically, with the controlled intensity of a man who had spent 6 years building a case and who understood that releasing 5 senior members of a criminal organization back into its operational structure would undo years of investigative work. He was right about all of it. He was overruled. 5 men would be released. Elena Drummond learned of the decision before it was formally announced because she had sources in the Department of Justice who trusted her more than they trusted the formal chain of communication. She received a phone call at 11 in the evening on a Thursday, listened for 4 minutes, said thank you, and hung up. She did not go to bed. She went to her desk and she opened a file that she had been building for 9 days. Not 9 days since the kidnapping. 9 days since the first intelligence had reached her through her own network that Pollard's organization was planning to take hostages. She had known it was coming. Her people in the mountain communities had reported increased movement among Pollard's courier network, a pattern of activity that suggested preparation for something significant. 2 of her longest established sources had independently reported that Pollard was planning what one of them described as a demonstration. The word had reached Elena 11 days before Ferraro and Whitfield were taken. She had not warned the FBI. She had not attempted to prevent the kidnapping. This was the decision that would sit with her for the rest of her life. Not because she doubted it was correct. She did not doubt it. She had calculated the operational variables with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 3 decades making decisions where every option carried a cost. And she had concluded that warning the FBI would result in a failed intervention that would alert Pollard's network, burn her sources, and eliminate the strategic opportunity that the kidnapping represented. The FBI would have attempted a rescue. The rescue would have been detected by Pollard's counter-surveillance. Ferraro and Whitfield would likely have been killed anyway, and the door that Elena could see opening would have closed permanently. But the calculation did not erase the weight of it. Ray Whitfield was dead. He was dead because Elena Drummond had chosen to let an event unfold that she could have attempted to disrupt. The attempt might have failed. It probably would have failed. Whitfield might have died regardless. These were the facts she could marshal in defense of the decision, and they were true, and they did not make the weight lighter. She carried it the way she carried everything, quietly, without asking anyone else to help her hold it. The file on her desk contained the operational plan she had been developing since the moment she understood what Pollard's hostage-taking meant. He needed people. Specifically, he needed the 5 men sitting in federal custody. His organization had been degraded by 6 years of FBI pressure, not enough to find him, but enough to thin his senior leadership to the point where he needed experienced commanders back in the field. And if Pollard needed those 5 men badly enough to risk the exposure of a kidnapping, then those 5 men were the most important thing in his world at this moment. Wherever they went after their release, Gareth Pollard would eventually be. The plan was simple in the way that the best intelligence operations are simple. It exploited a vulnerability the target did not know he had, and it required patience rather than force. She made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to a technical specialist at the Marshals Service whose name does not appear in any public account of these events. The second was to her deputy, a man who had worked with her for 14 years. The third was to a unit at the FBI's Signals Intelligence Division, whose existence was acknowledged only in classified briefings. This third call mattered most because what Elena was planning required capabilities her unit did not possess. Shadow Unit was built for human intelligence. Tracking what she intended to send into Pollard's network required the electronic surveillance infrastructure that the FBI had been operating for 6 years to no avail. The FBI's capability was not the problem. The capability was extraordinary. The problem was that it had been pointed at a man who produced no signals. Elena was about to give them signals to follow. The 5 prisoners were released on a Wednesday afternoon through a process described to the media as a negotiated resolution facilitated by the Department of Justice. Daniele Ferraro was released simultaneously through an intermediary in a small town in western Montana. He was dehydrated, frightened, and physically unharmed. He was driven to a hospital in Missoula and then flown to Rome, where he gave a press conference carried live on Italian television. In the months that followed, Ferraro would write a series of articles about his captivity that would be published in major European newspapers, articles that detailed the internal structure of Pollard's organization with a journalist's precision, and that would quietly confirm several pieces of intelligence that Elena's network had already gathered through other means. Ray Whitfield was already dead. He had been dead since the video. His body was found 4 days after Ferraro's release in a ravine outside of Hamilton, Montana. Pollard had decided that 5 prisoners was the price for the journalist, but the journalist's assistant was worth nothing in the negotiation, and killing him was how Pollard communicated that he set the terms, and the terms included casual, indifferent cruelty toward anyone who fell outside the boundaries of what he considered strategically useful. The 5 released men returned to the world they had come from. Before they walked out of federal custody, they were given what was described in the discharge paperwork as transitional support materials: clothing appropriate for the season, small amounts of cash, and personal electronics, phones, laptops, the kind of equipment that a man returning to civilian life after years in federal prison might reasonably need to reestablish communication with family, with attorneys, with the network of contacts that constitutes a life. They accepted these items without suspicion. They did not know what Elena Drummond had done to those devices. The tracking technology embedded in the phones and laptops was described in the single classified briefing that Elena provided to the Deputy Attorney General's office only as advanced persistent surveillance capability. What it meant in practice was comprehensive. Every location visited, every call placed, not just the number dialed, but the content. Every wireless network those devices connected to, and through that connection, the identification of every other device on that network. Every movement logged and timestamped and transmitted in real time to the FBI Signals Intelligence Team, which was now for the first time in 6 years, receiving actionable intelligence about Gareth Pollard's network. Not from Pollard himself, he still produced no electronic signature, but from the men he trusted, the men he needed, the men who were now walking back into his organization, carrying the instruments of his exposure. The weeks that followed required a discipline that was antithetical to every instinct of federal law enforcement. The natural impulse was to act on the intelligence as it arrived. Each new location represented a potential target. Each new contact represented a potential arrest. The temptation to move was constant and came from every level of the bureaucratic chain. Elena held the line. She held it through 3 separate meetings in which senior officials from the Department of Justice questioned why actionable intelligence was not being acted upon. She held it through a telephone conversation with Warren Leclerc that lasted 45 minutes and that tested the limits of professional courtesy. She held it through 2 weeks in which her own team asked with increasing urgency when they were going to move. Her answer was the same every time. Not yet. We are not hunting his lieutenants. We are hunting him. She was building a picture. The 5 released men were meeting with senior commanders. They were traveling to locations that had not previously been identified as part of Pollard's operational infrastructure. They were revealing the structure of the organization at a level of detail that 6 years of FBI surveillance had never achieved. But they had not yet met with Pollard himself. 3 weeks after the release. 4 weeks. The intelligence map grew denser. Then in the 4th week, one of the 5 men did something that sent a jolt through Elena's operation. He stopped using his phone. The man's name was Terrence Haldwell, and he had been the most active of the 5, traveling extensively through northern Idaho and western Montana, meeting with at least a dozen previously unidentified members of Pollard's network. His phone had been producing a river of intelligence, and then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the river stopped. Elena's technical specialist reported that the phone had been powered off and had not come back online. The battery had died. The phone had been lost. Or Haldwell had seen something that made him suspicious. She had to decide quickly, because if Haldwell was suspicious, every hour that passed was an hour in which he might communicate that suspicion through the courier system she could not intercept. She could pull the operation, move on every target arrest, every individual under surveillance, seize every location. They had enough intelligence to dismantle significant portions of Pollard's organization. It would be the largest enforcement action against a domestic militia network in more than a decade. But Pollard would not be among those arrested. He had not appeared. And if she moved now, he would know the operation had been compromised, and he would disappear, and it would take years to find him again. Or she could sacrifice Haldwell, cut him loose, trust that the remaining 4 sources would continue to produce. She made the decision in under 5 minutes. Burn Haldwell. Protect the 4. She ordered her technical team to remotely disable every traceable function on Haldwell's devices while leaving the basic consumer functions intact. If he examined the phone now, he would find nothing unusual. If he had already found something, there was nothing she could do except wait. The other 4 sources continued to operate normally. The intelligence kept flowing. Haldwell disappeared from the surveillance picture entirely, which Elena took as confirmation that he had either destroyed the device or handed it to someone in the organization's security apparatus. It did not matter. 4 was enough. 2 more weeks passed. May arrived. The mountain snow was melting at the higher elevations, opening trails and roads that had been impassable through the winter. Movement across Pollard's network increased. The 4 remaining sources were converging on a region of central Idaho, southeast of the Salmon River, where the terrain was rugged and the nearest federal presence was more than 90 miles away. On the 7th of May, one of the 4 sources traveled to a ranch property outside a small town that sat in a valley between 2 mountain ridges near the border where Idaho meets Montana. The source spent 4 hours at the property. The signals intelligence team reported that during those 4 hours, the source's phone detected 14 other wireless devices in proximity. The next day, a second source traveled to the same property. The day after that, a third. Elena looked at the intelligence summary on her desk, and she knew. She did not need satellite imagery or drone footage. She knew because she understood the pattern, because she had spent years learning how Pollard's organization moved and gathered and planned, and because every piece of intelligence pointed to this moment. Gareth Pollard was at that ranch. He was meeting with his commanders. He believed he was safe, deep in friendly territory, surrounded by the mountains and communities that had protected him for 6 years. She picked up the phone and called Warren Leclerc. The conversation was brief. She told him where Pollard was. She told him the intelligence was solid. She told him what she needed from his signals intelligence team. And then Leclerc asked the question that 6 years of institutional pride had prevented him from asking. What do you need from us to take him down? She told him what she did not need. She did not need a tactical assault team. She did not need helicopter support. She did not need a drone. She did not need any instrument of overwhelming force that would alert Pollard's network through the counter-surveillance system that had allowed him to escape every previous operation. What she needed was for the FBI to keep the signals intelligence flowing and to stay out of the way. Leclerc was quiet for a long time. This is your operation, Elena. Tell us what you need. She told him. Electronic eyes on the ranch for the next 72 hours. Nothing more. She hung up and made one more call. This one went to the team leader of Shadow Unit's direct action element. The call lasted 4 minutes. She gave the location. She gave the timeline. She gave the rules of engagement. Then she said one more thing that was not protocol and not procedure, but that captured something essential about who she was. Bring everyone home. The team leader confirmed. The line went dead. The 12th of May arrived the way most consequential days arrive without announcing itself. The weather was clear over central Idaho, the sky enormous and pale in the way it gets in mountain country when the last of the spring storms have passed. The ranch property sat in a valley that ran roughly north to south between 2 ridges covered in lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. A single unpaved road connected it to the county highway 4 miles to the west. The nearest town was 11 miles south. Pollard had chosen the location with the same strategic precision that had kept him alive for 6 years. The ridges provided observation points from which approaching vehicles could be spotted miles away. The single road was a choke point that could be monitored with minimal manpower. The surrounding terrain was roadless wilderness. An FBI tactical assault would require staging areas, vehicle convoys, helicopter support, and communications infrastructure. The logistics alone would take 3 days. The noise of the assembly would reach Pollard's network long before the first agent set foot on the Valley Road. What remained was what Elena had always intended to use. Trained people moving through terrain they knew at night without the support systems that made federal operations visible. Shadow Unit's direct action element departed after dark from a private property 60 miles northwest of the target. They drove in unmarked vehicles to a point 7 miles from the ranch property and stopped. The vehicles were left with a single operator who would remain in communication with Elena throughout the night. The rest of the team continued on foot. There were 12 of them. Elena had selected the number based on the intelligence picture of the ranch, which indicated a main house, 2 outbuildings, and a fenced area containing vehicles. The number of hostile personnel was estimated at between 8 and 15. 12 operators against a potential 15 defenders was not the numerical superiority that conventional tactical doctrine recommended. Elena did not operate according to conventional doctrine. She operated according to experience that had taught her that in operations where surprise and precision were the primary advantages, additional personnel added noise. Every additional body was an additional source of sound, an additional chance of detection. 12 balanced capability against invisibility. The approach took 5.5 hours. 7 miles of mountain terrain in darkness, navigating by topographic memory, and night vision moving at a pace that prioritized silence absolutely. The operators knew this kind of movement. They had been doing it for years in exactly this terrain, and the knowledge of how to cross ground without sound, how to read darkness for shapes that did not belong, how to feel the shift in wind that could carry a scent to a position not yet identified was present in every step. They reached the valley floor at approximately 1:30 in the morning. The ranch was visible below as a cluster of dark shapes against the slightly less dark expanse of the valley. No lights showing. Pollard enforced light discipline as rigorously as he enforced communications discipline. The signal's intelligence feed confirmed 14 active devices within the property boundary. Elena was not in the valley. She was 60 miles away in a room with 2 monitors and a secure communications terminal. She had considered being present at the staging area. She had decided against it. Her presence would add nothing to the execution, and the discipline of trusting the people she had trained for this moment was part of the philosophy she had built her career on. At 1:45, the team split into 3 elements. The first would approach the main house from the north. The second would cover the outbuildings and block movement toward the vehicles. The third would establish a perimeter on the south and west approaches, blocking the escape routes toward the road and the open valley. The movement from the valley floor to the property boundary took 22 minutes of crossing open ground, monitored by 2 sentries positioned near the corners of the main house. The operators had identified them through thermal observation from the ridgeline. 2 men armed but displaying the posture of men who had been sitting in the cold for hours, and who had been sitting in the cold for many nights before this one without incident. Pollard's security was built to detect the kind of threat the FBI represented. Vehicle approaches, helicopter noise, large numbers of personnel. It was not built for 12 people who moved like the terrain itself and who understood the specific acoustics of a mountain valley at night. The sentries did not detect the approach. They did not detect the perimeter team moving into position. They did not detect the assault elements closing to within 40 meters of the main house. The first sentry was neutralized at 2:11 in the morning. The second, 7 seconds later. The method was close and silent. The team leader confirmed both positions secure and transmitted the signal to execute. What happened inside that ranch house over the next 90 minutes remains classified. Elena Drummond's after-action report was filed under a security designation that restricts access to fewer than 30 people within the federal government. The operators who conducted the assault have never spoken publicly about it. What can be reconstructed from the limited information that later entered the public record primarily through the work of Harlan Kedge is the shape of what occurred. The entry was made through 2 points simultaneously, a coordinated breach that split the defender's attention and created the confusion that is the primary advantage of a well-executed close-quarters assault. The fighting moved through the house room by room at distances measured in feet, in spaces where the geometry of walls and doorways created angles that could conceal a threat until the distance between contact and outcome was zero. There was resistance. Pollard's men were armed and experienced, and unwilling to surrender to a force they could not identify in the darkness. The fighting lasted longer than any training scenario would suggest, because real buildings are not training facilities and real defenders do not behave according to doctrine. When the main house was secure, the teams cleared the outbuildings. More resistance. More of the precise controlled work of operators who have done this enough times that the movements are below conscious thought. And then it was over. Gareth Pollard was found in a room at the back of the main house. The room was small, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with a single window facing east. A desk, a chair, a cot. Maps on the walls. Documents on the desk. He was shot twice in the torso and once in the head. No ambiguity, no margin. The one-legged man who had laughed at drones and spoken federal agents' names into cameras and declared himself beyond the reach of anything the government could bring against him was dead on the floor of a ranch house in a valley that most Americans could not find on a map. Among the documents recovered from Pollard's room was a set of operational plans that Elena's team recognized immediately. Detailed targeting packages for coordinated attacks on federal infrastructure across the northwestern United States. Power relay stations, communication towers, transportation choke points on routes connecting military installations. The plans were specific, technically sophisticated, and included timelines indicating execution within 2 weeks. Pollard had been building toward this for months, assembling the personnel and materials through the same courier network that had made him invisible, planning an operation that would have demonstrated the vulnerability of federal infrastructure in a way that would have resonated through every militia network in the country and inspired a wave of imitation that federal authorities would have spent years containing. Elena had come for one man. She had prevented something much larger. The information was classified immediately. It did not appear in any public statement. The installations that had been targeted were quietly reinforced through channels that did not reference the source of the threat assessment. The knowledge existed only in classified briefings delivered to a small number of senior officials and in the memory of 12 operators who had found on a desk the evidence of what would have happened if they had arrived 2 weeks later. The team extracted before dawn, moving back through the valley in gray pre-dawn light. 12 people carrying their equipment and their wounded, because there were wounded 2 operators with injuries that were painful but not life-threatening. Moving with the steady pace of professionals completing the final phase of an operation designed months earlier and executed in a single night. Elena received the confirmation at 3:47 in the morning. Target neutralized. Team extracting. 2 wounded, neither critical. She sat at her desk for a long time. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone. She sat in the quiet and allowed herself to feel the weight of what had been accomplished, not just tonight, but over the months and years that had led to tonight. And she allowed herself to feel the other weight, the one she had been carrying since March. Ray Whitfield, 41 years old. A man who had done nothing wrong except take a job driving a journalist into country he understood better than most, and who had died in a concrete room because Elena Drummond had made a calculation that his life was part of the cost of the opportunity she could see forming. She did not tell herself it was the right decision. She did not tell herself it was the wrong one. She told herself that it was the decision she had made and that she would carry it for the rest of her life, and that carrying it was part of the work. Then she stood up. She made coffee. She began writing her report. The world woke to a different story. The Department of Justice issued a press release at 9:15 in the morning Eastern Time. The release described a successful law enforcement operation conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the support of interagency partners. It named SSA Warren Leclerc as the senior official overseeing the case. It credited the FBI's intelligence capabilities with developing the information that led to the identification of the target's location. OBC News ran the story at the top of the hour. CNN followed. The wire services carried the FBI's version to every newsroom in the country. By noon, it was established fact from coast to coast that the FBI had finally gotten Gareth Pollard. Warren Leclerc gave a press conference at 2 in the afternoon. He stood behind a podium with the FBI seal and the American flag and described the years of work that had led to this outcome. He thanked his team. He thanked the interagency partners. He thanked the communities in Idaho and Montana, whose cooperation had been essential. He did not mention Elena Drummond. He did not mention the Shadow Unit. He did not mention the prisoner exchange, or the tracking devices, or the weeks of patient surveillance. After the press conference, Leclerc returned to his office. He closed the door. He sat in his chair, and he looked at the framed commendation on his desk that had been delivered that morning, signed by the Attorney General, praising his leadership of the investigation. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and put the commendation inside and closed the drawer. He never hung it on the wall. 1,200 miles away, Elena Drummond was not watching the press conference. She was eating breakfast in the small kitchen of the building that served as Shadow Unit's headquarters. Toast, black coffee, the morning newspaper which she read for the weather, and the crossword. Around her, the members of her team were going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning. The operators who had been in the valley were sleeping. They had cleaned their weapons, written their preliminary reports, eaten, and gone to bed. There would be debriefings in the coming days. After action analysis. Lessons learned. But for now, they were sleeping, and they would wake up and there would be another tasking, and they would begin preparing for that. The absence of public recognition was not something these people experienced as a loss, because it was not something they had ever expected. The unit had been built on the understanding that its value was its invisibility, that the moment the world knew what Shadow Unit was, the capability would be diminished because the networks they penetrated and the communities they worked in would close the doors that had been open only because no one knew who was walking through them. The correction came quietly, as corrections do. 3 days after the initial announcement, a reporter at a major national newspaper published an article that was specific and restrained. The article stated that the operation that killed Gareth Pollard had not been conducted by the FBI. It had been conducted by a specialized unit within the U.S. Marshals Service. The article identified the unit's commander only as a senior female official with extensive experience in the northwestern United States. It noted that sources within the law enforcement community were deeply uncomfortable with the public record as it stood. The article ran on page 11. It did not generate the same headlines as the original announcement. It never does. Several years later, a man named Harlan Kedge decided the story needed to be told properly. Kedge was 62 years old and had been one of the most respected operators in the Marshals Service for 3 decades before his retirement. He had known Elena Drummond since they were both junior deputies in the Mountain West, back when the work was done with paper files and pay phones and boots that lasted 3 months before the terrain ate them. He had watched her career with the specific admiration of a man who understood how difficult the thing she did actually was because he had done a version of it himself. He visited the communities where Shadow Unit had operated. He spoke to the people who could be spoken to. He took the manuscript to the Department of Justice for security review. They cleared most of it because the facts made the government look competent. The only significant changes requested were the removal of certain operational details and the softening of language used by the operators themselves, language that the department felt did not project an appropriate image. Kedge, who had spent decades in the company of such operators and who knew exactly what the appropriate image was, complied. The book told the story of the Shadow Unit's campaign as what it actually was. One of the most sustained and successful law enforcement operations in the history of domestic security, conducted without public acknowledgement against a target that the most powerful investigative agency in the world had been unable to neutralize. Near the end of the book, in a chapter Kedge wrote in the first person, there is the exchange he had with Elena Drummond when he visited her to discuss the project. They were sitting on the porch of a house in Wyoming that was not far from where she had grown up. The mountains were visible in the distance, the same mountains she had been working in for 33 years. She was drinking coffee. She looked at the mountains and not at Kedge when she answered. He had asked her whether it bothered her, whether watching LeClaire stand behind a podium and accept credit for her work caused her any resentment. She was quiet for a while. The day they know my name is the day I cannot walk into a small town and listen to people talk anymore. The day my face is on television is the day every source I have spent my life building goes silent. You want to know if I am angry that Warren LeClerc stood behind a podium? I am not angry. I am relieved. Every headline with his name on it is a headline that does not have mine. And every day my name is not in the newspaper is a day I can still do this work. Silence is not the price I pay. Silence is the sharpest thing I have. Kedge wrote it down. He published the book. It was reviewed respectfully in publications that covered law enforcement and intelligence matters. It did not become a bestseller. It did not generate a film adaptation. Elena Drummond did not become a public figure. She did not want to. In the weeks following Pollard's death, 7 of his senior commanders surrendered to federal authorities. The operational plans found in his room were never executed. The network he had built over 2 decades collapsed without its architect, the way networks built around a single, indispensable leader always collapse when that leader is removed. The communities in central Idaho and western Montana that had sheltered him returned to the quiet rhythms of rural life. And the people who had provided information to Elena Drummond continued to live in those communities, and no one knew what they had done. Warren LeClaire received a commendation and a promotion. He accepted both. He did his job. He continued to do his job well because he was a good agent who served the institution he believed in. But there was a drawer in his desk that he never opened in front of other people. And when he retired several years later, the commendation was still in it. Elena Drummond continued to work. There were other targets, other networks, other problems that required the specific patience and skill that she and her unit possessed. She worked for another 4 years before she retired to the house in Wyoming, the one near the mountains, the one with the porch where she sat with Kedge and drank coffee and explained why silence was not a sacrifice. The FBI tried for 6 years with everything it had. The most advanced surveillance technology on the planet, the most sophisticated analytical capabilities in the history of law enforcement. The institutional resources of the most powerful government in the world pointed at a single man. Elena Drummond did it in one night. She did it because she understood something that the FBI's institutional structure made it almost impossible to understand. Some problems cannot be solved by the system designed to solve them. Some targets have engineered their existence to defeat precisely the tools the system provides. And when that happens, what is needed is not more of the same. What is needed is something older and simpler and harder. A person who knows the ground. A person who knows the people. A person who has been there long enough to understand what no technology can teach, which is how trust moves through a community like water, through rocks slowly and invisibly, until one day it has carved a channel that leads exactly where you need it to go. Elena Drummond was that person. She had spent 33 years becoming that person. And on the night of May 12th, all of those years, every cup of coffee in every kitchen, every conversation on every porch, every mile walked on every mountain road, every piece of trust earned and carefully maintained across 3 decades of patient, invisible work converged on a single point in a valley in central Idaho where a man who believed he was untouchable learned that he was not. The morning after the headline said it was the FBI. The woman who did it said nothing. She never has.